What do I say? Now you know. You got it?
Hello. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yes.
Welcome and thank you so much for being here. It's our collaboration with Hunter College in the last minute, really. And it's hard to imagine. Last time I saw a crowd like this was in a boat going back Revolution Camp in Vietnam. But it's a privilege in a way, and I would like to introduce the panelists briefly, and I would urge that you would ask thoughtful questions, simply because, why? Because it's more difficult to be thoughtful than to be angry. You must exercise that kind of predicament, that caught between, on one side, that I love, Edward Young, the great 18th century English poet, would say, why is it that we all born originals but die as copies? But then 150 years later, Apollinaire couldn't help but to express his optimism, the opposite. He say, even if nothing is new under the sun, the new spirit will not refrain from discovering new profundities. He knows this, that is not new under the sun. It's very important to exercise that balance right in between, because we want to generate good, positive, incredible, thoughtful insight. There's a lot of negative, criticism out there already, and I don't think that is useful. I don't think that's useful for anything in that. So far that we know in history, in the past history, there have been shows of artists. For instance, I can think of Philip Guston in 1970, in the winter of 1970, where he had that show, and Hilton Kramer wrote the amazing negative review. I think the title was called The Bumblebee, the Mandarin
Stumblebum.
Thank you very much.
Mandarin.
And even his best friend, the composer, Morley Feldman, turned away as a friend. And also, not long ago, in the late 90s, Vanderdo's show, High and Low, was also received the same treatment by Mr. Kramer. So we know those things turn out to be amazing, visionary shows, very courageous shows. So we're not here to advocate for negative energy, that flame that already circling around in the show was on not long ago. So anyway, I'd like to introduce our moderator and her fellow panelist. Carrie Moyer is a friend, old friend. She's a very active member of our art community. I don't know how she does it, but she was able to distill her amazing synthesis of political social activism, I think for a long while, in maybe early 90s until 2008, not long ago, infused that in art, insofar that it makes this amazing third form, the new form, which means that she, lately in the last several years, found the desire to spend more time in the studio, making works, on top of writing criticism and teaching also. It's more pronounced. So her show at the Tang Museum was that testament of all of the things she's been doing. And right next to her is Gray Lindquist, a rail colleague. I remember he came to the rail before 2008, and it's been a privilege to have observed him grow so slowly, so decisively. And I was informed to grow slowly. America love when you grow fast. Consume you spit out at the same token, Where I came from, better to grow slow. Remember that funny quote by Napoleon when he said for milk to become yogurt, culture in its yogurt, remember? It's sort of like that in a way. I'd like to introduce Greg in that sense because all this issue about environment and pollution has become his lifetime commitment. And it's nice to see him able to extend what's already been explored by Robert Smithson and Rachel Downs. And right next to Greg is my Ica colleague, the esteemed Amei Wallach. In addition to writing quite productively, she's happened to be an amazing filmmaker. Her film, you co-produced and co-directed with the late Marion Conjori, who I knew, of Louise Bourgeois, and her last recent film, Kabakov, was so interesting. Why? Because it revealed the why and the what of how these artists became who they became. And she's also a former president of ICA, and I'm very pleased to serve with her on that board. We're trying to make ICA, the Art Critic International Association, as hip as possible. If you guys want to join the membership, just call me at the Brooklyn Rail office. I don't.
I have to have a plug here. The annual meeting is going to be on the press day at the Whitney.
Yes, so pay attention. Alex Bacon is on the left of Carrie. When did you come to the Rail, Alex?
2012.
2012, such a young person. But he's so intense. He's invested equally in writing about the thing that he loved most as the thing that he doesn't quite understand. And Alex, ever since curated that show on the occasion of Reinhardt at Swanner, the correspondent show, which was the inaugural effort of the Rail Curator Project in 2013. He's been doing a lot of curation in Europe, in Cologne, Brussels, Berlin, and he's now trying to finish up his PhD at Princeton in art history in the first decade of French Stella. I want to be FW. On his left, on his right rather, is Phyllis Tuchman, who's known as a curator and a writer, and I don't know how she managed to do what she did the last recent years. The Earth Art Show at the Johnson Museum of Art and the Robert Smithson New Jersey at the Montclair. But the Motherwell Show that he stayed in East Hampton, the early years, was beautifully curated. And it's a pleasure to meet her anytime with a New Observer or Forum of America. She can be extremely feisty too. And she's the former president like us, so I also am very proud working alongside with her. And we always have a great time together. So please be thoughtful, but do join in. And otherwise, join me to welcome our panelists and moderator.
Wow, this is amazing that this many people care about painting. I know you can all make noises now. Welcome everyone to Hunter. I am an associate professor here, and we're really happy to have this panel that Phong and Sarah Ruffino organized. And Howard Singerman, our chair, who is not here tonight, is also one of the people who put this together, as well as the staff of the MFA building, who've done an amazing job here, because I don't think we've ever had this many people in this space. So just before we dive into the questions, I want you to notice that the selection of the panelists reflects the demographic of Forever Now. We have some women of a certain age and some young men. And I wonder if that was on purpose, or, you know. Anyway, so this is going to be organized thusly. We put together some slides which will run behind us. Mostly installation shots from the show and one image each of the artists in the show. We'll probably begin by speaking specifically about the show, but I would love it if the conversation sort of broadened out and talked about contemporary painting in general. Alex and Greg, because they didn't write a review specifically of the Forever Now, I'm going to sort of ask them particular questions that pertain to the things that they're interested in. So, to begin with, we'll just go straight for it. MoMA hasn't had a survey of contemporary painting since Keniston McShine's International Survey of Recent Painting and Sculpture in 1984. In her introduction to the catalog, Laura Hochman thanks certain MoMA colleagues for bravely supporting the Forever Now. So my thought on this and my question is, even though contemporary painting is incredibly popular, witness this, it is rarely shown in New York museums. And so my thought is, why are curators and art historians so late to this party?
Can I jump in on that one?
Yes.
And I do hope that we dispense quickly with Forever Now, because I agree with David Sally that it's the concept behind it is a red herring. I think that the MoMA, which likes to be au courant, understood and has been collecting contemporary painting and understood the moment had come to acknowledge contemporary painting, which has been all over for many years now. And I think they had to come up with a theory. I think Keniston was smarter when he did it not to have a theory. When Dorothy Miller did the 17 Painters Show in 1958, it was about a group of painters that were acknowledged as a movement and had been for 10 years. But Laura Hochman is jumping in at trying to look at painting right now and make decisions about it from a point of view, which is where I think the problem began.
Follow up on that?
You know, it's such an interesting problem because I remember hating Keniston McShine's show. I think that's par for the course. I mean, you just do one of these shows and there's a certain resentment, a certain jealousy inbred in the whole situation. I think part of the problem is that painting has not been this vital in such a long time, and Laura Hochman chose people that not everybody agrees with. And I think basically it's just not a win-win situation, it's more like a lose-lose. I recently had a look for some articles I wrote on sculpture, and I came across a review of Diane Waldman's Transformations of Sculpture show at the Guggenheim with 25 or 35 years ago. And it's the only review I ever wrote where I said, well, I think these artists are missing. Well, when I read those names all these years later, I think I was wrong and Diane was right. I think the people I proposed who should have been in the show, yeah, maybe. But she had a real commitment to what she did. And I said in my review, and I feel very, very strongly about it, I'd love to see these paintings 10 years from now, because I think they're going to look a lot different. And I just think we all are scared of the new. To do the Motherwell show, I was using a brochure from an exhibition that Rosa Esmond did years ago of reviewing all of the artists who had been in all of Dorothy Miller's exhibitions. And I'll tell you, there were a lot of mistakes. So,
But my quarrel isn't with the artists in the show. In fact, there's some wonderful artists in the show, and these were the artists she chose to show. My quarrel is with the conceit through which these artists are being shown. It is supposed to be that the internet has changed art, and yet it doesn't in any way. It's a surface look at how the internet changed art, and it's a surface look at how these are the artists who did it. I could go song and dance, and I won't, because I want others to talk about it, about what in fact I think these artists were doing.
Well, maybe just to quickly speak to that, I think that, I guess, like, I I think a lot personally in my own work about the role of the internet on painting, but I think that I agree with you in terms of the MoMA show. Specifically, I felt like the concept was a kind of general concept about society today, and was one that would be very hard either to show specifically visually, or else you could just kind of put anything in it in a certain way. And it didn't necessarily have specificity to painting. I mean, I think, as Carrie, as you suggested in our kind of conversations before, that, you know, in a way painting has always been hybrid and has always been a kind of appropriative medium. And then to speak to the other part of your question, which is why curators and art historians are kind of late to the game. As a curator and art historian, I think that for me it kind of goes back to the fact that in a way abstract painting has always been difficult, I think, for academic institutions, and it's kind of never really found a home there, either historically, and so in a certain way it doesn't surprise me that now there's still a kind of difficulty. I mean, not to say, of course, that, you know, these artists aren't put in a canon, but it's a different thing to say that they've really been kind of, you know, worked through in the same way that other figures, you know, have.
But I mean, MoMA is the temple to abstract painting, so I don't know if I would agree with that. And just to insert one thing, none of the artists in this show are new. You know, they're people that we've been watching for many, many, many years. So I think that, I know that the audience of the museum is very, very different now. I was just there on Friday, and it was, you know, Bjork fans snaking throughout the building. So maybe it's new to them. Not sure about that. But.
Well, also I think that if you look at the wall labels that describe the show, they connect it to MoMA's grand narrative. And what we're talking about is like Mark Roshan connected to Seurat, which is the beginning of MoMA's history. And abstract expressionism comes up with Kristen Bratch, Rashad Johnson, Joe Bradley, Richard Aldridge, and then you connect like Oscar Murillo's participatory work to Alicia Clark, who just had a retrospective there. I mean, what it does is it keys it into that history that's already there. And yeah.
And I think it's you know, MoMA's a corporation, let's get honest here, and it's a bit much to ask them to turn that ship in order to look at actually new art. It has to be a little bit market tested and a little bit collector tested before they'll look at it. I mean, you could maybe expect more of the new museum than you could expect of MoMA in terms of new art.
Well, I hate to be the fall guy here, or whatever the expression I should be using, but we all know what the fall guy is. But I feel like this show was organized for someone like myself. I don't go to galleries on the Lower East Side. I have not been to any galleries in Brooklyn. Many of the artists in this show were new to me, and I'm going to discover them.
Even though some of them show at Gagosian? I mean, just saying.
Well, I think it shows. I think that's a good. I mean, both of these for me are good points because I think it shows how, in a certain way, ghettoized the art world has become. There's kind of canons and groups, you know, for all kinds of different art, and there's almost a weird kind of segmenting. Even again, the fact that we're talking about painting, and there's an idea that we can kind of focus on painting to the exclusion of other mediums.
And yet so many people are painting. You go into almost any artist studio and they're painting. You go into almost any exhibition and it's painting. And maybe we can talk about why we think there is so much painting, even though so much of it, I think that you have to have different languages to talk about different painting. But I have a theory about why there's so much painting right now. One of them is that I think there's always been painting, okay? I think it became the other, and people went underground. And I mean, for instance, in the last couple of years, museums have been showing a lot of stuff they hadn't shown. There was a de Kooning show, there's going to be a Morris Louis show, there was a New York Abstraction show. There's a lot of abstract art out there for people to look at. The most important maybe was David Reed's show. What was that? I have the title here, but if anybody remembers.
High Times, Hard Times.
Yeah, High Times, Hard Times, and really a lot of the strategies that people are using in the MoMA show go back to that show, which is 1975 to I don't remember what. But I mean, that was an extraordinary show, and so there's been a lot around for people to look at. It's been revitalized. But also, I mean, okay, let's take this theory about the internet. The internet changes the brain. There's a lot of research to show the internet changes the brain. Well, that's actually a claim that all kinds of art has made for itself, but painting in particular. That painting, it tries to act as a break, maybe, a synapse to another way. And I could quote Natalie Provoski, actually, who quoted a poet who I'm not going to be able to find but it's something about we're all born original and end up as copies. And I think painting is trying to find another way, because it's a way of saying that a painter doesn't have to accept that way, that there are other ways that you can slow down time, you can make duration, you can make people pay attention, you can play off of minimalism, and also optical art, which made people complete the work. So painting has a lot of ways of doing things that the regular life and the distractions of distractions away from.
Okay, well, if we're going to talk about technology and talk about information and talk about these things that are apparently supposed to be part of that conceit of the show, then why don't we embed that in the process of the painting? Why don't we embed that in the paintings that are shown in the show? And I thought the Lauren Owens paintings were interesting for that reason, because you have these layers that are cut out and are mechanically reproduced, but they actually imitate or try to visualize the swipe motion that you make on a touchscreen. And it was really interesting because I took my junior seminar to that show, and they caught that immediately, that's what it was. And it was really interesting, and something that I've completely missed, and it's in a language that there's a lost possibility. It could have been pushed in much more interesting theoretical directions, but I have a feeling that that's not MoMA's target audience. I mean, we could talk about like recent writing by Alexander Galloway talking about interfaces and talking about how these things are mediated, how screens and how technologies are mediated in network, but it wasn't there.
Well, right, because I feel like one of the most interesting things that's happened to painting recently is in a way that it's kind of no longer, and I know you've talked about this a lot in your writing, but I actually think that the trend recently is away from a kind of expanded field of painting, but rather this kind of acknowledgement that there's something about even the objecthood of the canvas that has changed a lot. And I think that it's things like that, like for me, something that's become really interesting is thinking about how we just interact with something like an image differently. So it doesn't necessarily even have to be a kind of Laura Owens. And I think that, you know, people like Laura Owens get a lot of talk in this. I mean, I like her work, but I think there's almost too much focus on that work that kind of shows these, you know, kind of technological gimmicks.
Well,
and
I'm not
then,
saying illustrating,
yeah.
I'm saying that actually
Right.
embeds it in the process.
Right.
Yeah.
So for me, it's like that's one thing that's interesting, but then also, in a way, even like presenting a monochrome canvas is read differently. So I feel like in a certain way, technology has kind of swiped the slate clean. And so for me, it's no longer about kind of pushing at this kind of dead end as painting felt for so long, it seems. I think that for younger artists, they encounter painting in a way as this kind of open field. I really think that around maybe 2008, I mean, talking to a lot of younger artists, there's a whole group of people that around that time, they were trained kind of conceptually, and they kind of saw, I think, painting in the same way that the conceptual artists saw photography in the late 60s. It was this thing that was kind of empty and available. And obviously other things have kind of jumped in to kind of cloud the conversation, but I think that there's a lot to really think about in that way.
But I would argue that there's the way, I mean, from my point of view, this idea of atemporality is about setting up a framework for thinking about how painters are using source material in a different way. And, you know, the list of Matt Connor's artists who are inspiring to his work is mind-boggling, from like Kippenberger to, you know, Kenneth Nolan. So I think part of what was most interesting for me about the show is that we have a really different relationship to how images operate, perhaps because we're looking at things on the computer and not seeing them in person, but it's almost like creating a kind of tag cloud around your work. Like if you say, you know, a little of this, a little of that, and then so you sort of get the idea, even though you think you know what it looks like already. So there's, I think, for me, the framework was a way of answering the notion that a lot of these things look very derivative.
Do you think that's a tool of validation?
Absolutely.
Why?
Yeah, why?
Because I think that, I mean, as someone who teaches painting, you know, there's a great deal of pressure on the way we talk about painting and its interaction with the history of painting. So one is constantly prompted to bring people up. And, yeah, go ahead.
I mean, for me, it's like, what I found really interesting as an art historian is when I, like, if you take Frank Stella, for example, like Frank Stella first encountered Jasper John's work in reproduction in art magazines. So in a way, like, this kind of idea, I think, has, like, been in play for a while. And then when I talked to Mel Bachner about his encounter with Frank Stella, about, you know, 5 years, a decade later, he talks about being more interested in how Frank Stella looked in reproduction than in person. So again, you can see, I think artists are kind of always kind of making a creative misreading of the past in order to push forward their work. And I think often it's less that they're kind of looking to borrow and more that they make a thing and then they see the connections kind of after the fact. And like talking to Matt Connors specifically about his references, for someone like Matt, I think the internet has, as it has for many young artists, and he's actually not that young, but I think he's in his early 40s, but nonetheless, like for him, as for a younger generation, they've kind of found that the internet, in the same way that for Stella to find John's, it's kind of enabled them to access this material, and it's kind of flattened it. And I think in the same way that I was talking about like painting being kind of emptied and thus like an open field, I think history has also, I mean, it sounds maybe a bit kind of condescending to history, but I think it's actually been really profound for a lot of young artists to feel that they can engage with history without it weighing on them. They don't have to have this kind of Oedipal conflict that maybe like a Pollock had with Picasso.
But Alex, what do you think Frank Stella would have said if he would compare his work to other artists?
Well, are we speaking about him as a person?
Right. I mean,
you mean like younger artists, or like talking about his relation to John's, or?
if someone said, "What does your work look like?" and it's not what you see is what you see.
What do I think Frank Stella would say about what his art looks like?
Yeah, I mean, we're
Oh,
talking about listing names of other artists
Oh,
that are
okay.
pre-approved or already in the canon.
And also, yeah, and Frank
Well,
Stella
yeah.
is talking about Poussin. I mean, he's talking about,
Well-
art coming off the canvas, so it's not like he wasn't, but I hear what you're saying. I mean, I
Mhm.
love the idea that, that basically, the painting was available because it had been cleared. Just like
Yeah.
Kiefer said about minimalism, it emptied the seat so I could sit on it, so he could go back to painting. And so I mean, I think that's a really wonderful idea, that painting was available because the meaning had changed. But I'm not sure I buy this argument that the internet has flattened history. I think that artists always did that. They ran through the Metropolitan, they had a problem to solve, and somebody had solved it here, and
Sure,
somebody else had
sure.
solved it here. So I don't actually think that that's different. I just think it's more available, more easily available,
Right.
and more easily misunderstood, because of course the whole point of Frank Stella is the space, and he's saying what he got out of it was the flatness.
And
But
again,
I think the big difference, I mean, we know that when Gauguin went to Tahiti, he brought lots of postcards and reproductions of old masters and religious paintings. And, I mean, it goes back, Gauguin, keep going back. But the difference is the audience is also looking at the internet, and that's the change. Gauguin, you know, he was with his reproductions that were going to inspire him. his audience was off somewhere else. But the people going to the modern are sharing.
I've been here as a person who makes paintings. Maybe you could back me up on this. It's like, I guess I wouldn't say in my text, well, I really liked like Renoir when I was 14. You know what I mean? It's like the sort of expanse of these, there's kind of this need I feel to like produce data around your work, and whether it pertains exactly to the paintings that are being shown right now or the ones that have been made in the past 5 years. Is that the same time period as when you were starting out as an artist and you had predilections for certain things?
Do you think that's taught now? Art schools talk the talk?
I mean, I think it's, here I'm being a traitor to my people. I do think it's, you know, it's a lot of it is this sort of performative aspect around paintings and being able to discuss them seriously and analytically and know your references and all this stuff. I do think that's part of it.
But I mean, to speak to what Phyllis was saying as well, I think that in a way, this flattening is how we encounter culture in general. Like, you know, I don't just go to the record store and like pick out 5 records. I go on Spotify and I see a million things that I'm looking for, things I've never heard of. And so I'm absorbing all this material simultaneously. So in a way, I don't think, like, in a way, of course, like young artists are maybe, they're still going to the museum, they're still like picking up books, they're still seeking things out, but I think in a certain way, we're absorbing things constantly, and I think it would be wrong to try to resist that action. And so I think that, again, artists are just being honest, and I also want to insist that I think it's also happening. I don't really think it affects the work per se, that it's like a kind of cloud to support the work. I mean, and so one example would be like Jacob Cassay told me that one of the ideas behind the silver paintings was going to MoMA and seeing Manzoni and having an experience with Manzoni, and then going home and reading about Manzoni on Wikipedia and getting a certain idea of reflectivity, and then going and getting like a catalog. So there's like all these layers to, you know, and it kind of makes sense, you know, that you would approach these things both as objects and as kind of this kind of weird, you know, internet cloud of information that's not really peer reviewed, and then you go find, you know, the catalog of the expert. Like, I think that again creates a certain interesting relationship that younger artists had to that history.
And his paintings of all make a different space in which to experience them.
Absolutely.
I wanted to follow up on Phyllis's comment about the audience also using the internet in a similar way as the artist, because one of the things that strikes me as someone who has to put JPEGs out in the world is like, how do you communicate what a painting, what the tactility and the surface of the painting are? I mean, to me, that's as much a part of this sort of descriptive cloud of associations as anything else. Because, you know, you're trying to like create some sort of sensation in the mind of the viewer. Because the internet reduces them to these graphics, essentially.
I think a lot of young artists, like some things I'm really interested in are some artists who manage to both create an object that does certain things in space that are not reproducible, but then also has an activity when it becomes a JPEG, understanding that inevitable space. And so, for example, like Cassay's paintings, you can't really, like, he likes that the autofocus of the camera can't attach to it. It can't find a kind of discrete object, but nonetheless they do reproduce, you know, in some way, and they look quite beautiful in reproduction, but there's no way to have that sense of seeing yourself in this kind of blurred reflection that you have in real space, or the way that Israel Lund's silkscreen paintings have a very particular kind of non-space, I think, like you kind of can't penetrate them in person, but then when they go online, they become these kind of weird perverse versions of themselves. And I think a lot of the things that have been written about his work is more about the JPEGs than the paintings, but I think what's interesting about that work is that he thinks a lot about that, and his work comes from making zines and posters and thinking about this circulation.
So I just wondered if people had any thoughts on this.
You know, I saw that as one of your questions, and I don't believe that. I think art has that weight on it. I think our expectations of art is that it will have meaning and weight and make a difference in how we perceive the world or experience it. You know, in the Brooklyn Rail, Barbara London, who is, you know, a video curator, asked lots of artists how they used their tools. And she asked Ken Okishi, who works, you know, kind of the gap between video and painting. And, you know, he takes pictures of Joan Mitchell paintings on cell phones and then puts them on screen, kind of painted together. And what he says is, and then he puts it together with the Apple vocabulary of swipes, taps, and drags. And what he says is, there is an urgency at the moment in our ever-tightening range of feeling in visual experiences that artworks make us aware of the multiplicity of different modes of seeing and feeling, and that these differences are made distinct and distinctly material. And painting does that, but not just painting.
I'm gonna have to disagree there. It's the history. The history is so long since cave painting. And for painting to be able to regenerate, repopulate, reinvent itself over and over again is a huge weight and burden for any artist to go into the studio and do something that feels new in some way. And I think the other kind of flip side of that, the dark side of that, is that so much money now more than ever is being invested in painting.
Oh, somebody likes the marketing.
We have to admit,
Try to stay away from that.
I wrote out a statement with pretty sentences, but I could summarize a little bit of it. But a number of years ago, and when I looked up how long ago, I was kind of freaked out. There was a Baccioni retrospective at the Metropolitan Museum, and I ran into William S. Rubin in the gallery with Baccioni's Cubist portraits of his mother. One was a painting and one was a sculpture. And Bill Rubin was my professor, so of course I was interested in which he thought was more radical, the painting or the sculpture. And he said, the painting, of course. And this has bothered me forever. What did of course mean? And so in what I wrote for this evening, it just seems to me that of course means there are more painters than sculptors in this world. And that's a large part of it. Then I went on in what I wrote to say that...
Do you want to read it?
No, it's too formal now. Basically, I think the greatest artwork I saw in the past year was Carol Walker's Big Sugar Baby. And that answers, again, part of the last question. More people paint. When I was at Yaddo, I discovered there are, I think, more poets than painters. And, you know, it's just about numbers.
But isn't it that why there are more painters? Because painting is seen as this, you know, painting and everything else, you know.
I really want to insist from my experience that, like, a lot of the more high-profile younger painters came not from a painting background. Like, I really think there's something to that people found somehow painting available and interesting. And actually, I think the academic, and I'm speaking both of art history but also of the art school, I think has been kind of against painting, at least in a kind of, as a kind of quote-unquote radical avant-garde medium. I mean, obviously painting has an established space both in art history and in art school, but I think it was, I mean, a lot of artists tell me, like, you know, someone like Jerry Saltz has made a lot about somehow like this work is about the MFA, but I think, first of all, a lot of these artists don't have MFAs. Second of all, most of them that do tell me that MFA was something they kind of had to work against, like the training they got was not maybe the most useful, it was too kind of traditional. Because I think, again, the reasons why they were drawn to painting are not the reasons that maybe an older generation that was teaching them was painting.
What was the difference? What was the difference?
Well, what do you...
Between why they were drawn to painting and their teachers were drawn to painting.
Well, so in one way, I would say that a lot of these artists didn't study painting. Like Jacob Cassay studied photography, for example. and Dan Rees studied sculpture. So I think a lot of them actually, again, entered into the academy in the spaces of kind of accepted, like institutional, avant-gardism. And then when they were there, the ideas that they were kind of learning, which they very much, like Dan told me, that he really kind of, like for him, it's a conceptual art of, the 60s is like the number one thing. And then, but he thought, oh, painting, and why not take this decorative, technique from painting, put it into work. And then, I could go on about his work as a kind of specific example if that's interesting, but I guess that's what I mean. It's a kind of framework. I think a lot of artists saw painting less, and maybe this is the main difference between the generations, is that painting for them is not a kind of like expressive medium, but rather it's a kind of framework to present an idea, whether that's a kind of perceptual idea, or it's a certain material that has been taken from the world and repositioned, whether it's a kind of a process like the silver plating of Casset's work. There's a kind of a lot of different ways to think about it, but it's not, for many of those artists, presenting an image, for example.
Well, expressive, I think that had been gone for a long time,
Yeah.
actually. That's not taught. But then, one thing, I have a real bugaboo about this. When I see a young artist, I like to mention Rilke's Letters to a Young Poet, because an MFA show to me is kind of the worst thing that can happen to an artist, because it takes a long time to figure out what it is that interests you and what it is you do. And so sometimes that means jettisoning everything you learned in art school, but whatever it means you need the time to figure it out.
But I just
I totally agree with that.
wanted to follow up on what Alex is saying. First of all, this is not unique to this generation. Mary Heilman talks about painting being that place too.
Right.
So it's, and back to the David Reed show. That's how many of those artists spoke of painting as being this space of permission. I guess my problem with the people that you've written about is that they actually treat painting like sculpture. So it's strategy in a particular way.
What do you mean by that?
Well, I'm talking about like Jacob Casset, and I feel like it's like, okay, I want to get a certain kind of surface. How will I do that? I will plate it with silver. You know what I mean? And then it's like all about the
But that's
sort of
not.
material.
But that's not like the conceptual thing behind that work. Like for Jacob, it was about thinking about perception. Like so for Jacob, like the most interesting artist is like Joe Bayer, and he's interested in this idea of like how painting can play with perception. So this would be for me in one case a kind of lesser known history of abstraction, right? Like Joe Bayer doesn't have a kind of place in the canon next to maybe like Robert Ryman. But I think, and so that's interesting in and of itself, but it's like for him, he was thinking about how painting could do something perceptually that was different. So he had the idea to plate the canvas because what he discovered is that you don't get a mirrored surface, you get this kind of, washed out, fragmented image. So what's interesting for me about those paintings perceptually is that when you walk up close to them, the closer you get, the more blurred your reflection and the reflection of the space becomes, and then the further back you step, the clearer it becomes. So you're never, in a way, you're moving back and forth, and you're never really getting this kind of perfect image, this thing that we expect. We expect to be reflected back, and I think this has a lot to do with our expectations of, access to imagery and, to identity and all these things. And so, again, for me, I think there's this idea, like, this is why I really dislike the term, well, I actually quite like it in a certain way, zombie formalism, but I think it's actually applied to the wrong work. I think Gerhard Richter is a zombie formalist in an interesting way because he sees, for example, painting as impossible, and he's working through the kind of like the zombie of its remains. But for someone like Jacob, he's thinking actually, oh, there's a whole world of perceptual experience that hasn't been addressed. And painting is a kind of a nice, again, device by which to have this experience. So for me, it's incidental that it's plated. That, it's necessary, but he was finding a way to realize this idea. So it gets, I agree with you that it's a strategy, but it's...
Do you know who Carrie Yamaoka is?
Well, I don't know who Carrie
She's been doing I don't know. I mean, I'm not trying to diss you at all.
No,
I'm
no.
Just, the idea that she just jumped into my mind.
Or Richter for that matter.
Yeah. So,
Well, I mean,
sorry, I meant to be a conversation stopper.
no, I mean, but at the same time, I think there's a I mean, but why does Jacob Cassay also have to be the only artist, right? Like, no one says like, oh, look, other people have dealt with like the squeegee or whatever. I mean, I feel like there's space for lots of artists to investigate certain problems. Like perception is a huge, I mean, you could argue perhaps that painting has always been about perception in some way, you know, so again, I'm just saying like, I want to insist at least that he has a sort of idea rather than seeking a kind of just a way to make something.
Well, I think that point is a very good one that you've just made, because in fact, you're talking about perception as if he invented it, and there's this long history of artists who have struggled with issues of perception. I mean, that is huge. And here we are, we're saying that on the internet you can access any time, but the fact is you can access it on a very superficial level, or you can go much deeper if you want to, easily.
Right.
But generally, everybody mentions Wikipedia, right? And so you're not actually trying to understand what has painting said about perception in the past so that I can understand what to say about it in my own time. You're reinventing perception.
Well, again, I wouldn't want to be misunderstood as saying that, and I don't think Jacob would say that either. I think that he really, again, like as I said with the Joe Bayer connection, like he sees this kind of history, you know, both recently and in a more distant past, and again, that's what drew him to painting, away from photography. So it's like, you know, I don't think that perception is reinvented. I mean, perception changes. Obviously, again, I would say the internet, you know, it's maybe not interesting to harp on that, but nonetheless, like, it presents new ways to think about perception. So that is true of Jacob's paintings. I think they do speak to a kind of digital context for perception. They're certainly not the only works that do, but yeah.
Yeah, well, this became the Jacob Cassay.
Here, here.
Strangely. I guess one question that also occurred to me while I was, you know, have been thinking about this show and sort of preparing for this is painting the only subject for painting? I mean, because that's basically what the show is about. It's like, even someone like Rashid Johnson, who very freely talked about personal experience, the thing is so sort of put into this, I don't know, it's like, and I know many of the painters in the show, and I don't think they would ever speak about their work that way, especially Mary Weatherford or Amy.
Yeah, or Julie Meharitu. How do you say her name? Yeah.
Would speak to their work as about painting, you mean?
Well, there's a kind of, based on the wall text and the way things were presented, it was really about their engagement with art history, and less so about the sort of dailiness of making paintings or all the other things that happen in the studio or in your life that go into making paintings.
Right, I'd like to think about that in terms of like going back to Alfred Barr and writing about Cubism and abstract art in like the 1930s and removing almost all of the social context from it, making it purely about formalism and a form of history of shapes and colors.